devastation in Mexico. A strong earthquake kills hundreds. How Pope Francis is responding to the tragedy. Peace in the Middle East. President Trump meets with leaders in the region on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Healthcare overhaul. GOP senators scramble to pick up the votes needed to repeal and replace Obamacare. We're on Capitol Hill. And Father Stanley Rowthorn, a mass this week brings the Oklahoma priest one step closer to sainthood. We'll explain. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, September 20th, 2017. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Lauren Ashburn is on assignment. At least 225 people are dead after a strong earthquake hit central Mexico. The search is on tonight for survivors. Police, firefighters, and residents frantically dig through the rubble of collapsed schools, homes, and buildings looking for survivors of the 7.1 magnitude quake. It's Mexico's deadliest earthquake in decades. One of the most desperate rescue efforts taking place in a school in southern Mexico City. At least 25 students and teachers are dead. A highway in the Morelos state snapped in half, and an old church in Chile de la Sal damaged.
Mis condolencias a quienes perdieron un familiar o un ser querido.
Mexico's president, Enrique Peña Nieto, expresses his condolences to those impacted by the quake. The U.S. Geological Survey says it hit at 2:14 Eastern yesterday afternoon, centered near the Puebla state town of Rebozo. The quake striking on the 32nd anniversary of the 1985 earthquake that killed thousands. We spoke to a resident of Mexico City who felt the earthquake and is already helping in the rescue efforts.
I am in Mexico City, in the middle of a disaster zone, and we are actually going in this moment to a hotel that just came down, and we are living this. There are many people that are here are helping, and that gives everything they have, food and everything, medicines. And there are many, there's a lot of solidarity that you can see here in Mexico.
Marilu Esponda of Catholic Voices Mexico asked for prayers and for the intercession of Our Lady of Guadalupe during this tragedy. Hurricane Maria batters Puerto Rico after tearing through the U.S. Virgin Islands and other parts of the Caribbean. Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico this morning as a Category 4 storm. Two-thirds of the island experienced hurricane-force winds. Flooding for residents in low-lying areas could bring extensive damage to homes and buildings. The storm isn't expected to weaken in the next 24 hours, or 48 hours rather, as it makes its way toward the Bahamas. Republicans scrambled to replace Obamacare and defund Planned Parenthood. They have until the end of the month to get the 50 votes they need to pass a bill. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi tells us how this bill could impact you. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. The last-ditch Republican bill would cut key parts of Obamacare. You wouldn't be forced to have insurance, and employers wouldn't have to offer it. Federal health care dollars would go to the states. Tonight, the rush is on to get Republican senators on board.
Republicans' make or break moment to make good on 7 years of promises.
I think it's very important that people like me who feel like Obamacare is fundamentally flawed, that it is going to fail, and that if we don't get to a point to where we believe we're taking the first step to making sure that people can have affordable insurance, are likely to get care.
Dispatching as vice president to rally Republicans this week, President Trump tweets today, "I hope Republican senators will vote for Graham Cassidy and fulfill their promise to repeal and replace Obamacare. Money direct to states." Swing state Republican Cory Gardner backed the failed health care bills, but today,
trying to get some more information on it, looking into the numbers. We don't have the numbers that we think we need to make that decision.
The Congressional Budget Office hasn't released estimates of how the bill will impact the country. It would shift Obamacare's money to the states in block grants, and that money is routed through an existing federal program that already bans money from going to abortions. The states then would set their own coverage requirements, but Democrats are unanimously opposed.
Millions will lose coverage. no guarantee of pre-existing condition, and an end to Medicaid as we know it.
One of the co-authors of the bill says that's wrong.
More people will have coverage, and we protect those with pre-existing conditions. States like Maine, Virginia, Florida, Missouri, there'll be billions more dollars to provide health insurance coverage for those in those states who have been passed by Obamacare, and we protect those with pre-existing conditions.
Senator Bill Cassidy there defending his bill after late night host Jimmy Kimmel accused him of lying. The senator on Kimmel's show previously promised that people with pre-existing conditions would be protected. The bill does say coverage must remain adequate and affordable, but critics fear insurance companies could jack up prices to unaffordable rates. Wyatt?
Jason, do Republicans have the 50 votes they need to pass the bill?
So far, one Republican, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, says he's a no vote. He says it doesn't do enough to repeal Obamacare. Senator Susan Collins of Maine is deeply critical, but she still hasn't given her final decision. Now all eyes are on Senator John McCain of Arizona, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, both undecided tonight.
Still sounds like a long way to go. Correspondent Jason Calvi at the Capitol. Thanks, Jason. President Trump is at the United Nations meeting with world leaders and talking big ideas, including what he says may be the toughest deal of all time, a peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. Correspondent Mark Irons reports from the White House. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. President Trump says it would be a great legacy for everybody if Israel and Palestine could achieve peace. The president stopped short of making a promise, but said he has a very good chance of negotiating a deal.
I mean, we're looking seriously at peace and maybe ultimately peace in the whole of the Middle East. And I think we have a pretty good shot, maybe the best shot ever.
President Trump expressing optimism, though there are few tangible signs that progress toward a deal has been achieved. His remarks came ahead of a meeting with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas says the Trump White House is committed to the cause, noting U.S. delegations have met with Palestinian officials more than 20 times since Trump took office. Talks with Israel are ongoing as well. The president met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu earlier this week. Trump calls achieving peace between Israelis and Palestinians the ultimate deal.
Historically, people say it can't happen. I say it can happen.
Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, a White House advisor, is charged with restarting peace talks that have been on again, off again for years. The modern conflict is over 50 years old. Palestinians want their own country, drawn from land currently occupied by Israel. A two-state solution, the preferred outcome for Democratic and Republican presidents for decades, would give Palestinians their own country. Vice President Pence, also on the sidelines of the UN summit, says peace is a priority for Trump.
Our president is a man of deep conviction and faith. Faith in God and faith in the boundless capacity of peoples and nations founded on peace and justice to improve the world.
Today at the UN, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas said Israel is jeopardizing the two-state solution by expanding its settlements into Palestinian territory. Israel's UN ambassador responded saying Abbas is spreading falsehoods. Wyatt?
Mark, I understand during that photo op with Abbas, President Trump also commented on the Iran deal. Is that right?
That's right. Trump says he has made a decision on the future of the Iran nuclear deal, but he refused to go into detail. Tomorrow, his meetings at the UNGA continue. Trump meets President Moon of South Korea and Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister of Japan. Expect North Korea's nuclear threat to be a big topic of those meetings.
I'm sure both topics will. Correspondent Mark Irons at the White House. Thanks, Mark. British police arrest 2 more people in relation to the London subway attack. Detectives say the suspects are a 48-year-old and a 30-year-old man in Newport, Wales. That brings the total number of arrests to 5. A homemade bomb went off on Friday during the morning rush hour on a packed London train. An Indonesian court sentences an Islamic militant to 11 years in prison for leading a plot to attack a presidential guard-changing ceremony in Jakarta. One of his co-conspirators received 6 years in prison. Both were arrested in December, just 1 day before their planned attack on the popular family attraction at the presidential palace. Pope Francis leads tens of thousands of people in prayer for the victims of the Mexico earthquake.
A toda la querida población mexicana.
Speaking in Spanish, Francis ad-libbed a prayer, saying, "In this moment of pain, I want to express my closeness and prayer to the dear Mexican people." Francis acknowledged many Mexican pilgrims were on hand for his weekly general audience today in St. Peter's Square. Alan Holdren is the EWTN Rome Bureau Chief. Alan, what was the reaction of the Mexican people present today to the Pope's words?
Well, Wyatt, I caught up to about a dozen Mexican citizens after the audience, and they were all very grateful for the Pope's attention and for his prayers. These people were following very closely all of the news by way of their cell phones coming from home. There was a woman who I asked what the Pope's words meant to her, and she said that it really meant the world, and she broke down in tears. Really a moment of tension, them being so far away from home right now, but they're also participating, they said. Many of the people were taking part in prayer chains and were also organizing themselves with their parish communities to send relief in the form of money and also supplies. The Pope also had a moment at the very end of the audience where he prayed a Hail Mary with his children's choir that was there from Mexico to sing for him.
Pope Francis is focusing on hope every Wednesday at his audiences. How does hope play into his message today?
Well, Wyatt, he said that he wanted to speak to people one-on-one, specifically young people and people who wanted to learn. He said that these people should never lose their hope. They should always be on the lookout for ways that they can build up society according to God's plan, and never to yield to negativity, never to be afraid to dream, to use their God-given talents for the good of society, building up justice, freedom, and human dignity. It really sounded a lot like a commencement speech at a high school, Catholic high school or university commencement graduation ceremony. It really was a strong message for those present. There were a lot of positive reactions to what he said.
Sure, such an important message, and sounds like a very inspirational moment there in Rome today. Alan Holdren, EWTN Rome Bureau Chief, thanks so much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Coming up.
On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2016, Desiree, my baby, was brutally murdered.
Cracking down on sex trafficking. We'll talk to a senator who introduced a bill to fight it. The Sistine Chapel Choir continues its U.S. tour with a concert in Washington, D.C. The Pope's Choir performed in New York Saturday and will be in Detroit this Saturday. Tomorrow on News Nightly, we'll highlight the group and what it took to bring them to the U.S. First Lady Melania Trump calls on world leaders to step up to improve the lives of children.
Whether it is drug addiction, bullying, poverty, disease, trafficking, illiteracy, or hunger, it is the children who are hit first and hardest in any country.
The First Lady spoke at the U.S. mission to the United Nations today in New York. The audience included spouses of world leaders. Mrs. Trump is calling on nations to come together for our children's future. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill are pushing a new bill aimed at cracking down on websites that facilitate sex trafficking. It would close loopholes in current laws that allow websites like Backpage.com to advertise unlawful sex. The bill prompted an emotional response during a congressional hearing this week from families who have been impacted.
The sex trafficking of minors should not be happening in our country. Taking advantage of our children on the internet has become such a common thing in this country that people turn the other cheek just because they don't want to believe it's actually happening right here in our backyards.
Yvonne Ambrose's daughter, Desiree Robinson, was trafficked on Backpage.com and murdered. Senator Rob Portman is a Republican from Ohio. He is one of two lawmakers who introduced the bipartisan piece of legislation. Senator, thank you for joining us. How will this bill help stop sex trafficking?
Wyatt, unbelievably, in this country, in this century, we have an increase in sex trafficking. And it's happening primarily online, and the growth in it, according to all the experts, is happening online. So what this legislation does is goes after those unscrupulous websites that are selling women and children online. The most prominent one is called Backpage.com. They have probably 3/4 of the commercial sex traffic on one side. On that site, they knowingly sell people, including underage girls. And so this legislation is meant to target that specific problem. If we don't do that, our fear is that we'll continue to see a growth. It's really a stain on our national character that, again, in in this country at this time that we're seeing a growth in what is really a horrific crime.
It is pretty scary. In your testimony yesterday before the Commerce Committee, you said sexual predators have moved from the street corners to the smartphone. You say it's ruthless efficiency. How can we protect minors when technology makes the trade so easy?
Well, it's a challenge for us, and frankly, what has happened is that over the last 20 years, federal legislation, which was put in place to help protect internet freedom, has been interpreted by the courts, I think in many cases misinterpreted, to give immunity to these actors on the internet that actually engage in this criminal activity. So one thing we can do as parents, as citizens, is we can say enough. We're not going to allow these websites to be able to engage in criminal activity while having an immunity under federal law. So our legislation does that. The courts that have been asked to take up the cause to try to stop this trafficking have said to the victims and to law enforcement, well, we understand that this is immoral, we understand that this is going on, and the stories, are just absolutely heartbreaking. So what we're saying is very simple. We're not affecting the freedom of the internet at all. We preserve that, but we're saying that for criminal activity, specifically knowingly engaging in sex trafficking, that those people should be able to be prosecuted. They should be liable so that victims can have their day in court and get justice. And by doing that, Wyatt, I'm convinced we can make a huge difference in turning the tide on trafficking and beginning to save the lives of so many girls and women.
And of course, we will continue to follow this piece of legislation as well. Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, thanks so much for talking with us about it.
Thank you, Wyatt, and thanks for what you do to try to stop sex trafficking.
Young girls aren't the only victims of sex trafficking. Statistics show an increase in young boys who are exploited too. Lauren Ashburn recently spoke with our next guest about raising awareness about male victims.
Haley Halverson is the Director of Advocacy and Outreach at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Haley, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is an underreported story. In your report, from 24 countries that you collected data from 2000 until today, you found that child sexual abuse estimates range from 3 to 17% for boys, 8 to 31% for girls. Why isn't it known that sex abuse and sex trafficking is harming boys at an alarming rate?
We're seeing really an era of silence around the sexual exploitation of boys and men. Society often promotes these myths that men or boys can't be victims. They're often met with more distrust than girls are when reporting those things. So the National Center on Sexual Exploitation is launching a concerted effort to raise awareness around these issues, to break that silence and bring these issues out of the shadows.
The number that really jumped out at me is in New York City that 45% of youth who are trafficked are boys. 45%, that's almost half. What are the links, first of all, between sexual abuse, sex trafficking, and pornography?
Pornography is absolutely linked to all of this. We see that young boys who watch violent pornography are more likely to report sexually abusing another child. Child-on-child sexual abuse is a rising problem in our country. And child sexual abuse is actually the strongest predictor of becoming a victim of trafficking later on in life. So we're absolutely seeing that those links exist.
You said that you are going to raise awareness about this hidden and ignored suffering of boys. What are you doing? What are you asking lawmakers to do?
Well, lawmakers can make a big impact by amending Communications Decency Act, Section 230. This is a law that's basically giving broad immunity to websites that are knowingly facilitating trafficking of boys and girls online. And so Congress can make a big effort by amending that law.
Will we see a communications campaign out of your center?
Absolutely. You can learn more at endsexualexploitation.org/CDA to learn more about that law.
And what is CDA? Communications
Decency
Decency
Act.
Act.
You got it.
I got it. All right. Thank you so much. Haley Halverson, Director of Advocacy and Outreach at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation.
Thank you.
Up next, Catholic bishops respond to President Trump's speech at the UN. We'll speak to the conference's executive director for Migration and Refugee Services. Plus, on his way to sainthood, we're days away from the beatification mass for Father Stanley Rowthorn. How you can watch. Today, the church honors 103 members of the Christian community in Korea who gave their lives as martyrs. The included group includes St. Andrew Kim Taegon and Paul Chong Ha-sang. The saints were canonized in 1984 by Pope John Paul II. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. The state of Kansas has suspended the medical license of a former Planned Parenthood physician. The doctor is being penalized for 90 days for failing to preserve fetal tissue samples from a 13-year-old girl's abortion. The remains were supposed to be sent to authorities after the 2014 abortion that's required by a state law for patients under the age of 14. President Trump laid out his vision for dealing with migrants during his first address to the UN General Assembly yesterday.
We seek an approach to refugee resettlement that is designed to help these horribly treated people and which enables their eventual return to their home countries to be part of the rebuilding process.
President Trump added uncontrolled migration is unfair to the countries of origin and those receiving migrants. His remarks struck a chord with the Catholic Church in America, which has long helped immigrants who seek a better life. Joining us now is Bill Canny, Executive Director of Migration and Refugee Services at the USF Conference of Catholic Bishops. So, Bill, what was your reaction when you heard President Trump when he got to that section of the speech talking about migrants?
Well, first of all, the talk about refugees is important. It's very important that the United States does, as he suggested, increasingly support refugees who are surrounded in countries from the Syrian war. I point out that to date, only 40% of the needs of that population, very basic needs, have been fulfilled this year. So more can be done. However, making a choice between resettling a very few number of refugees here and helping those people in those countries is a false choice. We can, as we've done over the years, resettle a fraction, very small, less than 0.5% of those in need of resettlement here in this country, some 75,000. So support helping more overseas, but do not agree with the idea that we have to do that at the expense of a small fraction that we bring here to become our neighbors, to take care of, to help children get out of the squalor of those camps and those semi-urban centers that they're currently living in.
So let's expand a little bit more on that, because like you say, the American bishops agree with some of those elements that Trump mentioned, but let's talk a little bit more about what specifically they can do more. Should we be taking in more refugees? Is that the idea? Because I believe the Trump administration is hoping only to take in some 50,000. Is it all about the number, I guess?
You know, it's just not about the number. It's about personalizing our assistance and our help. It's about encountering, as Pope Francis said, those in need, refugees in need, being with them. Each year for the last 10 years, we've brought in about an average of 75,000 to 90,000 refugees into the country. Our parishes all across the country welcome them, help the kids in school. We find them jobs at a very high rate, etc. We want to continue that program. President Trump has proposed to cut that program in half, from 100,000 to 50,000. We're suggesting the bishops and many other groups to have at least 75,000 continue to come into our country.
As you know, Bill, this is such a tough issue because the Catholic Catechism of the Catholic Church has two important points on this that are essentially equal. One is that we have to welcome the foreigner, the stranger, the idea of that. But at the same time, we as a nation need to protect our borders and protect people for the sake of the common good. So what do you say to Catholics who think that the U.S. needs to focus more on the common good at this point?
Well, first of all, I would be careful to point out that during these last years, particularly since the recession, the number of people coming into the country, quote unquote, illegally has diminished significantly. So it's decreasingly an issue, and certainly is not an issue that I think warrants a wall. So that's important. Yes, security, every time the bishops talk about this issue, they recognize that security is important. You know, we cannot live in fear of people coming into the country. At the same time, we all know the story of our immigrant country. We all know the contributions that immigrants have made. We need to continue to welcome those that we can, and importantly, take care and regularize that population in the country that's here. And they're here because we all participated in having them here at this time.
Bill Canny, Executive Director of Migration and Refugee Services at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
The beatification mass for Father Stanley Rowthorn takes place Saturday in Oklahoma, and church officials have been working hard to prepare, including collecting relics. A rib was removed from Father Rowthorn's body and sent to Rome. His heart remained in Guatemala after his death. It's now housed at the mission parish he served. Father Rowthorn was killed because of his faith while in Guatemala. The sainthood process includes collecting relics from the potential saint. And you can watch the beatification mass for Father Rowthorn right here on EWTN. It will air live this Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern. The beatification is the last step before being declared a saint. And you can read a lot more about the relic collecting and about Father Rowthorn's life right now at CatholicNewsAgency.com. And we thank you so much for watching tonight. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. We leave you tonight with more images from today's general audience at the Vatican. Good night, and God bless.